In this video, we're going to cover virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is another reason-based, universalist, moral theory. And in particular, we're going to focus on the original virtue ethics, which is Aristotle's version. So this is a quote and a meme that's kicked around the internet quite a bit if you're interested in philosophy. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Right? So in this quote, Aristotle is emphasizing that, essentially, that to be an excellent person, it's not a static state of being, like the way you would look at, okay, that rock is hard and that water is liquid, for instance. That's a state of being, right? Excellence or goodness in a human being is a result of repeated action and practice. It's a dynamic state as opposed to a static state. And this is what he's emphasizing in this quote. If you want to be a good person, which any rational person ought to desire, he would say, you practice excellence on a daily basis in all that you do. So just a tiny bit about Aristotle. He lived in 385 to 322 BCE. He was a student of Plato's, and he was a teacher and tutor of Alexander the Great. And he wrote on physics, metaphysics, epistemology, biology, zoology, government, politics, art, poetry, music, theater, ethics, you name it. Aristotle covered it. And the Nicomachean Ethics, people believe, is a transcript of a lecture he gave at the Lyceum. The Lyceum was a school that he founded in Athens. So it wouldn't be a school like you'd think of one today, but, it was a gathering center for listening and learning and debating. And it's thought that this lecture transcript was either edited by or dedicated to Aristotle's son Nicomachus, but we're not entirely sure about that. So, Aristotle's ethics is known as virtue ethics, and its particular focus is on the cultivation of character. And to cultivate something means essentially to practice it into existence, to nourish it, to pay scrutinous attention to its development and exercise it until it becomes a thing, until it takes form, until it manifests. And for human beings, it manifests as character. So here's a grounding idea. Aristotle posits that the ultimate good toward which all of our acts are directed is human flourishing, or what they called eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, but happiness is a mood, right? Happiness is a fleeting emotion that we experience in response to a pleasurable stimulus. That's the way we translate it today. So to translate eudaimonia as happiness is a little bit misleading. It's human flourishing in the sense of you're firing on all cylinders. You are all of your human powers are flourishing and working to your advantage. You are as much, or aiming toward as much as you could possibly be. And so Aristotle's saying that ultimately everything we do for this eudaimonia, to flourish and be in a state of constant flourishing, right? And we seek that for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. So if we compare this to, for instance, the greatest happiness principle in utilitarianism, right? It's utilitarianism, and John Stuart Mill derived a lot of his thinking from Aristotle. So in a sense, they both agreed about what the ultimate good is. How should I act? How should I behave? Well, what is going to promote the most eudaimonia in you and everybody else, John Stuart Mill of utilitarianism would say, right? Very similar to this. How ought I behave isn't quite the question that Aristotle was seeking to answer, but he did say that, look, the reason we do anything at all is because we think it's going to increase our eudaimonia, or our state of flourishing, and we seek it for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. So now compare this to Kant's categorical imperative, where he distinguishes between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, right? If I want to be wealthy, then I ought to work hard, right? That's a hypothetical imperative. Or if I want a good reputation in the community, then I ought to build this community center. Right? Those are hypothetical imperatives, where Kant says a categorical imperative is, do this behavior, period, not toward any other end. It's the ultimate for Kant. Here with Aristotle, the thinking is a little bit, it's not the same by any stretch of the imagination, but it's similar in the sense that all of these thinkers are trying to say, toward what does everything we do aim? Why do we do anything? Because if you can clarify the idea of what's the final good, end, purpose, telos in Greek, if you can identify that, then hopefully you can figure out how to behave. Aristotle identifies the ultimate good as eudaimonia. And again, it's properly understood as human flourishing, a dynamic activity and not a static state of being, right? It's a dynamic activity that's specifically appropriate to the human soul, quote unquote, at its most excellent, or what he'd call virtuous. So a little more background on Aristotle and Aristotle's thinking is a few ideas about form and function. So for Aristotle, everything has a function or activity that's specific to its particular form, how it manifested in the world. So everything has a function or activity, or a purpose, you could say, right? This is ancient thinking. This type of thinking is called teleological, in the sense that telos means final goal or purpose. And once we hit the scientific revolution, we essentially dispelled of that kind of thinking, teleological thinking, and instead we began to focus on the hows, right? How does this happen instead of why does this happen, toward what end? Right? But Aristotle and ancient Greeks and ancient people in general thought teleologically. Toward what end is this thing supposed to function? So a few for instances, and it's it's easy to start off with an artifact, right? So to illustrate this idea, a knife's defining purpose or function is to cut. So an excellent knife cuts well. If you have a dull knife, you'd say, this is a bad knife. You've got a sharp knife, you'd say, it's a good knife. Right? Or even animals, right, and humans, as we'll see. But Aristotle would look at a horse and say, well, you can look at the form of the horse. Look how it manifested and the shape it took, right? So a horse's defining purpose or function is to run, Aristotle would say. So an excellent horse performs its function well. It runs well. So conversely, if a horse was, let's say, born missing a leg or was injured or lame, Aristotle might say it was a bad horse because it doesn't perform its defining function well. And regarding humans, he said a person's defining purpose or function is to reason. So an excellent person reasons well, is rational. So for Aristotle, a bad person does not perform his or her defining function well. In other words, does not reason well or is irrational. And that's what makes a bad person. So briefly again on eudaimonia, virtue involves living according to reason. And virtue involves the practice of reason out there in the world, right? Reason or rationality embedded in all of your actions and every decision that you make. And only by living according to reason can we achieve this eudaimonia, human flourishing, firing on all cylinders, or happiness, right? But remember what I said about happiness, which is the ultimate goal. In other words, you will never flourish as a human being unless you are living according to rationality or reason. So here is the premise conclusion format of Aristotle's function argument. So premise 1, the good for members of a kind is to perform well the function distinctive of their kind. And 2, to perform the function distinctive of one's kind well is to perform it in accord with the relevant virtue. We'll cover this in a moment. And 3, the function distinctive of humans is reason or rationality. Happiness is the good, the ultimate good for humans. Remember, eudaimonia, flourishing, is the good for humans. Therefore, eudaimonia, happiness, flourishing, is reason in accordance with virtue. So let's unpack this notion of virtue a bit. For Aristotle, virtue is a reason-based trait of character cultivated by habitual action, which is practice, mindful practice, specific practice. And the habits that we develop result in what's translated as states of character or dispositions to act in certain ways, right? But these are potentialities, right? So when we say states of character, it means that once you start working and practicing and cultivating certain virtues, they result in a potential state, like you're building up strength in a sense, that you are going to be more disposed to act in certain ways under certain circumstances. Imagine that you are in a gym, for instance, and you go and really it's just gym activity, weightlifting, right? So you're in there and you're doing, let's say, bicep curls, a lot of bicep curls, and you're practicing them on a daily basis. And what's going to happen? You're going to build up the bicep muscle over time with that cultivation, with that practice, right? And then you're sitting around your house with a built up bicep muscle. That is really just a potential state of action. Where it becomes important is, let's say, if you have to lift something heavy off of somebody, right? That's when it's activated. So you could, in Aristotle speak, you could say you're cultivating the bicep muscle, which is developing, and then it results in a state where you're going to be able to utilize that bicep muscle if a circumstance calls for it, right? So Aristotle wouldn't really think of it in terms of the bicep now looks a lot better on Instagram, for instance, right? He'd think of it in terms of its function. So we can have habits that result, and this is important, we can form habits that result in an excessive state of character, or we can form habits that result in a deficient state of character, or we can have habits that result in a moderate state of character. And Aristotle's going to equate the moderate state of character with virtue, a balance, right? So excessive is when the left side of the scale is down. Deficient, the right is down. What you're looking for is a balance, right? And that he is going to identify and equate with the virtues. So the moderate state of character then is virtuous. And virtues are means, or I guess averages, right? The balanced state. So virtues are means poised between two extremes. And a virtue is the mean by reference to two vices, the one of excess and the one of deficiency. So essentially, in any given circumstance, right, in a standard human being, a given circumstance, you can have three possibilities, and a lot of different degrees in between, but let's just posit that it's three possibilities for action. And reaction. You can encounter a situation that calls for some type of response, and you can behave excessively, or you can behave deficiently. But if you strike a balance between the excess and the deficiency, you'll find the moderate course of behavior, which Aristotle's going to say, boom, aim for that. That's the virtue. Excuse me. So this is a chart of Aristotle's concept of what's referred to as the golden mean, right? Or the golden moderate state. So you've got a list of the moderate states here that exist between deficiencies and excesses. So the middle column are the virtues, and a deficiency in the virtue would be considered a vice. An excess of the virtue would be considered a vice as well. So let me put a concrete example to this, or somewhat concrete. let's imagine that you find yourself in a situation where an elderly woman is alone. You walk up and an elderly woman is alone and attacked by an aggressor who's trying to take her purse. Boom. You are in a situation, no doubt. So how does one practice in this situation? What ought you do? Right? Well, sorry. If you just act on your quote unquote instinct and you don't think it out for even just a second, you may run away to save yourself, right? Which would be a display, not just a display, but you'd be practicing cowardice in that sense. You're scared, you're off balance, and you just run. Well, you'd be practicing cowardice into your character. On the other hand, if you are hit this situation and you just respond without thinking and you run in to help, because that's the particular state of character where you are in that situation, right? Your emotions just tell you, get in there and help. And you rush in without considering, perhaps, how big is this person compared to me? There's nobody else to help, or maybe I forgot my phone, or maybe that person has a gun, right? If you just rush in, based on emotion, that would be an excessive reaction. You would be practicing rashness into your character. But if you split the difference and practice courage would be taking stock quickly, using your reason to take stock of the situation in the moment, consider everything that you're able to consider, and acting accordingly. That's what courage is in this particular circumstance, right? So what Aristotle would say is, regardless of how you feel instantly, whether it's that you want to run away or whether it's that you want to rush in, use your reason to determine the best course of action, and despite how you feel, practice courage in that situation. So again, we develop the virtues through habit, exercising them, by practicing them and modeling our behavior after others who are considered virtuous. This is how you become a virtuous person. You practice the moderate state of character between two extremes, regardless of how you feel. You make a decision and you practice it, and you practice it consistently, just like you're going to the gym, right? If you want to develop your muscles, you exercise your muscles, not just once, you do it continuously. And then before you know it, your muscles are developed. It takes time, right? But then they're developed, and it has to be upkept. It's the same with the virtues, Aristotle would say. Many of you who play a musical instrument might be able to relate to this example. If you play guitar, the first time you picked up a guitar, it probably felt awkward. It probably sounded bad. It was probably confusing and foreign, right? But if you just react to those feelings of confusion, foreignness, and awkwardness, you put it down, you don't do it anymore. But if you really desire to be a guitar player, you work through it. You practice it. And then at a certain point, you cross over into being a guitar player. You don't have to think about it as much anymore. It's yours. It's become part of your character. And many musicians who I speak to remember this moment very well. The moment when they realized they were forgetting their fingers because playing the instrument had been ingrained in them. That takes practice. So practice again until they're ingrained in you and become part of your character. So virtue ethics emphasizes a different aspect of the conditional relationship between being a good person and practicing virtuous behavior. And I just realized I meant to put in a couple more things on either side of these arrows, but have to imagine that right here, where my mouse is moving, it says good person, and over here it says virtuous behavior. So virtue ethics emphasizes a different aspect of the conditional relationship between being a good person and practicing virtuous behavior. So instead of this, if you're a good person, then you practice virtuous behavior. It's this. If you practice virtuous behavior, then you are a good person. Obviously, this slide escaped my more scrutinous attention before I started this, but this should just say, if you practice virtuous behavior, then you are a good person. So the point is this. Many people today will look at somebody and think, that's a good person. How do I know? Because I see them doing something virtuous. That's one way. That's a more let's say it's a post-Aristotelian way of looking at morals and virtues, right? But the emphasis is different. What Aristotle would say is he would look at somebody practicing virtuous behavior and say, that's a good person, right? The relationship, the emphasis is just swapped in moral evaluation. And there's a quote from Charles Reade, who was an English novelist, that captures kind of the essence of Aristotle's virtue ethics. Sow a thought, you reap an act. Sow an act, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you reap a character. And sow a character, you reap a destiny. And I like that quote. I love that quote personally, but the language is a little bit antiquated, so it's been modernized, to fit any of the mindfulness movements, which are based on Buddhist practices, really. So this is the same quote in slightly different words. Mind your thoughts, for they become your words. Mind your words, for they become your actions. Mind your actions, for they become your habits. Mind your habits, for they become your character. And mind your character, for it becomes your destiny. So a few strengths, commonly recognized strengths of virtue ethics as a moral theory is that it not only answers the question, what should I do or how should I act, but it answers the question, how should I live? Right? Which encapsulates the what should I do part as well. How should I live? How should I go about my daily life? What type of person ought I become, rather than how should I act in this particular circumstances, which is the focus of many of the other moral theories that we've studied. It also emphasizes moral education. It emphasizes the fact that being virtuous is a developmental process. Being a moral person is something you have to cultivate. It takes time. It's not a boom decision. It's not on or off. You don't go from being a quote unquote bad person to being a quote unquote good person in a heartbeat. It's a developmental process, similar to learning an instrument or developing your muscles. Also, another strength is that that theory avoids using a formula like the greatest happiness principle or the categorical imperative to figure out what to do. Instead, it focuses on what sort of person we ought to strive to be, which we've captured in the previous 2 bullet points. Also, it understands the difference between a good person and a law-abiding one. And this is an issue I think many of us contend with on a daily basis. Just because somebody is law-abiding doesn't make them good. And a good person under Aristotelian virtue ethics isn't always a law-abiding one. Now, notice the difference between this perspective and, for instance, social contract theory, which equates being a law-abiding person with being a good person, right? And because modeling one's behavior after other virtuous people is such an important component of this theory, it factors in the need to become good role models for others. Under virtue ethics, it's important for a person trying to cultivate their character to find a role model so that it's manifested before you, right? And you can see what they do and what they've done to become what they are. And you pay attention to that. And you, in a sense, mimic their behavior. Do what they do. Now, there's also some standard objections to virtue ethics as a moral theory. And that is, one, it offers no solution to specific moral problems or moral dilemmas, right? Should I or should I not do this specific thing? Should I or should I not lie to my friend in order to spare her feelings? There's no formula here. Right? So the greatest happiness principle you might be able to run that calculus and it'll tell you what you should do in this circumstance. The categorical imperative is going to just tell you not to lie under any circumstances. So there's a solution, right? But you don't get that type of specific guidance with virtue ethics. Another criticism is that not everybody has the equal opportunity to develop morally in the Aristotelian sense, because not everybody has access to role models. And that's a criticism, is that if this is going to be our guiding moral theory, what are you going to do about people who live in places where predominantly their quote-unquote role models are people of questionable character, let's say? Also seems to be able to praise some virtues that may seem immoral to people on face value, like on the face of it. For example, soldiers fighting a very unjust war. They may be exercising courage, and maybe they're courageous, but does it make them good if the war is unjust? So there's some ambiguity around the virtues themselves and whether or not this list of virtues will be will hold under certain circumstances. And also, it doesn't seem to have room for the bigger notions associated with morality, like rights and obligations involved in living in society. And that's essentially a philosophical goal for many philosophical system builders, that you lay down your metaphysical and epistemological arguments, right? Your arguments about what is real, what is the case, how we can know that, and that these arguments are then supposed to lead to arguments about ethics. Well, now that we know what is real, what is the case, and how we can know those things, we can infer how we ought to behave, and that's ethics. And then once we know how we ought to behave, then we can start to build political systems and speak of rights and obligations involved in living within those political systems, right? And the objection here is that virtue ethics, I guess, just doesn't make that transition very well, doesn't lend itself to the next step of philosophical development, which is political philosophy. Okay, so we covered virtue ethics as a reason-based universalist moral theory, and specifically we looked at Aristotle's version, although there are other versions that are usually fall under the description of, they're usually called neo-Aristotelian. We looked at the strengths of Aristotle's version and common objections to Aristotle's version.